Alrighty, everybody, hello. I hope your spring break was awesome. Just a reminder, please take notes while we will go through this video, create 2 to 3 comments or questions for tomorrow's live chat on YouTube. And just a couple updates for you guys. The school is officially closed until May 15th. The governor made a public announcement last Friday, I believe it was. We're going to move forward and still use our 25-point grading system that the district is having us use. It's officially marking period 4. I've submitted all grades. Keep checking Google Classroom for updates. And my last day, Mr. G's last day, is May 8th. Okay? So Mr. Roebuck and I are going to start working together to try to begin to transition him back into being the main instructor. Okay? So, we're going to get into Truman, Eisenhower in the 1950s. Unfortunately, because we're not in school, I can't do nearly as much as I wanted to. Like this slide says, this is one of my favorite times in history. I just love the aesthetic. I love the history. I love the products. I love everything about the 50s. On the right is a skincare line created by Elizabeth Arden. Some of you might know her. Her name is still printed on a lot of stuff. We'll get to her in a bit. So this is just our outline for those of you who want to write notes. Pause it now and write this stuff down so that you can refer to it easier later so you can organize it. So World War II ends. Okay, the United Nations is created to keep world peace. The Potsdam Conference, run by President Truman, the British, the French, the Russians, the Soviets. At this conference, they talk about what they're going to do with Germany, and basically what they say is they're going to split up Germany. We talked about this before. They met at the Yalta Conference, but now that Truman's in charge, he had another meeting, and there's a different prime minister in the United Kingdom now. Instead of Churchill, he got voted out. It's now Clement Attlee. But at the Potsdam Conference, all you need to know is that there were talks between the remaining world powers. The Soviets clamped down on Eastern Europe and create satellite states. So the Soviet Union, of course, is the main power center of the communist movement. But then you get little countries like Yugoslavia, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria. All of these states are going to become satellite nations. And what that means, and by the way, all bolded words you need to know, what that means is they're going to work closely with the Soviets, and they are basically going to be their closest allies, give support, give intelligence, all that kind of stuff. Truman's, his term is up, and Eisenhower takes charge. He's in power from 1953 to 1961. We'll talk about him in a bit. Churchill, since he's not prime minister anymore, is still against communism, comes to the United States and gives the Iron Curtain speech. This says, hey, everybody, wake up. Communism is coming. We don't know what's going on behind the Iron Curtain, okay? The Iron Curtain is obviously not a real thing. It's this white line that you can see separating the red from the blue. So the Democratic West from the Communist East. So the Iron Curtain is really a metaphor for the mystery and danger that the communists pose. Okay, Stalin finally dies in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev takes power. So then we get into the Cold War. Was the Cold War actually a war? No. But after World War II, the only remaining powers left in the world are the United States and the Soviet Union. You could argue that the British were a world power, but they had lost so much territory and strength that the United States and the Soviet Union were the only ones who came out of it relatively unscathed. And we see this division of the world. You've all heard of the term, it's a third world country. They're so unorganized and, all those horrible things. Well, it comes from the Cold War. The West was saying, hey, we are going to be the first world because we are Western Europe, we are the capitalists, we are the most organized. Then the second world is the Communist parties, mostly in Eastern Europe. And the third world refers to all newly independent colonies, Africa and parts of Asia. And what we see is a global fight between communism and capitalism for supremacy. In the United States, the Democrats and Republicans agree that communism and socialism cannot be allowed to spread, so they all endorse this idea of containment. Okay, Truman puts into play containment policy, which means we're going to obviously try to contain communism. The Truman Doctrine says, hey, we're going to give funds to Greece and Turkey. We want to give money to them so they don't become communists and they stay our allies. The Marshall Plan goes into effect, which basically gives a lot of money to rebuild Western Europe. And it really helps Europe get back on its feet. And another thing that Americans are worried about is this thing called the domino effect. The idea of if Greece becomes a communist country, the country that's connected to it is Turkey, so that would be the next one to fall, and so on and so forth. So every country that falls to communism will ultimately knock into another country. Okay? Very, very, very nerve-wracking. We see the beginning of the nuclear arms race, where we see indirect engagement. As we'll see in the Korean War and Vietnam, the United States will use these third world countries to fight their battles so they don't go to nuclear war and end the world. So then we get into the Korean War. We're not going to cover this a ton, but it's important to go over. So this is a picture of the monument in D.C. To memorialize the Korean War American soldiers. It's not as big as it looks. It was much smaller, in fact, than I thought it would be. So this idea of indirect engagement, if we can fight through another country, we can avoid global devastation from nuclear weapons. So the communists take over North Korea, the capitalists and the so-called Democrats of the world take over South Korea, and the United States installs a president in South Korea that had not been in the country for 40 to 50 years. It's this whole big thing. On Thursday, you'll watch like 10 to 13 minutes of a documentary that PBS made that's excellent. They'll talk about him. He was very unpopular. He was very much a thug and treated people horribly. In the North, the Soviets install a leader who knew the people, was a communist, and successfully kept power. Yes, it is the man, the myth, the legend, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. Okay, they're going to start North Korea. So the war starts. Truman and MacArthur begin fighting immediately because Truman does not want to keep attacking into China and does not want to keep pushing and being as aggressive, whereas MacArthur, like we remember from World War II, wants to be super aggressive like he was against the Japanese. And so at the end of the war, one more thing, MacArthur gets fired by Truman because he's a general versus the president. So he gets fired, very controversial. The 38th parallel officially splits Korea at the end of the war. It makes North Korea and South Korea, okay, two different countries, two different governments, two different militaries. Now we can finally get to the part 2 stuff. So domestics. On your right is President Eisenhower. Okay, the slogan "I like Ike" was the big term for his campaign. So FDR and Truman were both Democrats. They were in power for about 20 years, and the Democrats become very unpopular. They controlled Congress and the presidency for about 20 years. But then Eisenhower's elected. He's a war hero from World War II. He's elected as president as a conservative Republican. However, the Democrats quickly regain power in Congress. And what Eisenhower does is he's going to constantly cut down on the Navy and the Army. Okay, and this thing called brinkmanship. He's going to have the United States consistently ready for battle. And even though he's cutting down naval and Army forces, he's going to build up the Air Force. Okay, because what are we going to use during war now? Are we going to use nuclear weapons, or are we going to send soldiers on the ground? No, we're going to use nuclear weapons. So if we expand our aircraft and we can create a stronger Air Force, we'll be constantly ready for war. The idea that we're on the brink of war, even though they might not have been. Major contributions of President Eisenhower, very important, the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. This creates an interstate, meaning going through several states, highways, so that the entire country is connected. This is unprecedented. It's a massive project, and it really connects America. We can finally drive from one place to another without having to go through dirt roads or, using these obscure old maps. We finally have one direction system. The Civil Rights Bill, very, very famous. We'll talk about that more when we get to civil rights, is passed under him. He creates the CIA. He appoints Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. He becomes Chief Justice. Earl Warren is an extremely important figure. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to talk about him. However, he makes a lot of reforms with the Supreme Court, a lot of liberal reforms that really help Americans. Okay, so one of them is, when somebody gets arrested and they say you have the right to remain silent and they read you your rights. Well, that came under Earl Warren. Okay, he has a lot of things that really prevent what we saw in the 20s with, consistently violating constitutional rights. Okay, he also installs the Shah in Iran. When we get to Iran, we'll talk about that more. If you remember from world history, the Shah is basically the king who turns Iran, who is the leader before the Muslims take over Iran. Then in the United States, we see a surge in McCarthyism. You probably heard of McCarthyism before. It's the idea that there are communists in America. Senator McCarthy is driving this. He's saying there's a bunch of people in the United States government that are communists. I have a list of them, but I'm not going to share it with anybody. So anybody who spoke out against McCarthy or McCarthyism, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was in charge of persecuting people who were suspected communists, they would blacklist you. So if you were a celebrity and you were protecting people that, or even arguing on behalf of people who were suspected communists, you would be blacklisted. Nobody would hire you. Nobody would want to deal with you. Okay? And the only thing that really fueled this was two alleged spies, the Rosenbergs, that were tried and executed for being supposed spies. Okay? They were communists, but just because you're a communist doesn't mean you're a spy. There really wasn't that much proof that they were indeed spies. However, they were still executed. Then we get to suburbia, okay? The move to the suburbs. If you've ever seen Edward Scissorhands, those cookie cutter houses that have, all the same look, different colors, straight street, white families, perfect straight families, thin families, all these kinds of stuff. So people are going to be moving away from the cities, and they're going to move to the suburbs, okay? And because they're in the suburbs, their jobs are still in the city. So people are going to start buying cars left and right. Cars are going to be very, very, very cheap, and they are going to be readily made and safer for people than they had ever been. So automania is the idea that we're buying cars in mass, and we are driving from the suburbs to the city. Of course, there's a bunch of racial divides. I would have liked to have gone into this. Had we been at school, a big policy that came as a result of suburbia was called redlining, which still is a thing today. My dad's a real estate agent. He could tell you flat out the reason that African Americans are clumped together and these communities are designated poor and dangerous, or it doesn't even have to be African Americans. It could be any race or minority group. Because your town is, perhaps a little bit poor, even though it's the system's fault, we are going to make your obtaining loans more difficult. We are going to call you and your neighborhood ugly and run down and dangerous. So it's going to be it's going to lower property values across the United States because of racism. And finally, the baby boom. The soldiers come back from World War II. They get with their ladies. They have a ton of families. Okay. And they move to suburbia. So then we get to domestics and pop culture. I love going over consumerism. The idea behind consumerism is we're going to sell, and companies and corporations are going to make as much money as they can. They're going to sell vacuum cleaners to refrigerators to household products to Jell-O. So this thing called planned obsolescence is really starting to be used by companies, which means I'm going to create a toaster, However, I'm going to make sure that this toaster will only last 2 years so that this family will have to go out and buy another toaster. So it's making more money for selling the double the amount of toasters because we're just making them less efficient, less sustainable, and less long-lasting. Sounds illegal, but it was not. Very important word. We have the rise of the middle class. We could finally afford to buy things because they're being made in mass and they're finally cheaper. Fruits, vegetables, different kinds of foods, houses, all this kind of stuff. We see the rise of conglomerates and franchises like McDonald's, the rise of television. Televisions start flooding the households, replacing the radios. They're still black and white and only have about 3 or 4 channels, and all shows end at midnight. But we start seeing a bunch of TV shows that really reinforce the idea of the suburbs and the white family. There's mass media, meaning for once teenagers are able to talk about the same thing. Adults are able to talk about the same thing. They're all talking about, what TV show was on last night? Did you hear what happened? Did you see the news? Did you see the TV show? It creates a collective identity, a collective thing we can talk about. And targeted marketing starts coming up. So back to that idea of Elizabeth Arden, okay, the makeup brand. We're going to target women. We're going to make this idea of beauty a thing. We're going to make the women who are thin and blonde and pretty wearing makeup as the ideal. You can't get a man if you're not wearing Elizabeth Arden's cosmetics. So in this time, we see the rise of cosmetics. All right, we see Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, 2 of the first women in the United States to own or be a CEO or president of a major corporation. Okay, very rich women, very, very, very interesting. They hated each other, big competitors. I believe L'Oreal bought Rubinstein's brand, and Arden is under, I cannot remember which brand they're under. If you remember, shout it out. But the idea of the 50s housewife was so important. If you're not a housewife, you're not successful. If your husband cannot sustain you and your house and your family with his job, not only is your man not really masculine or a man, but you haven't achieved the American dream. Women, if your husbands aren't good enough, you're not able to leave them. You're going to be miserable for the rest of your life. And finally, we see the fall of Rosie the Riveter, this idea that women could go to work and be strong, be productive. There are very limited career opportunities. Once the war ends, women become, again, nurses, secretaries. But we start to see more women going to work in this time. The Broadway show 9 to 5 is an excellent depiction of this. And Betty Friedan, one of my favorite people in history, although she did have a lot of cons, wrote The Feminine Mystique in the 60s, but we'll get to that later. Thank you for listening. I know this was a bit of a long one, but I had to get through all of the 1950s in one slideshow. Okay, so make sure you have your comments and questions, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I will talk to you tomorrow during the live chat. Have a good day.